Thank you, Dr. Owen, for the overview on the Green Climate Fund. As you would have seen from there, actually, there's lots of money being poured in there, concerns raised by philanthropists, by developed countries, but still that money is still not enough. That is the extent of damage that has been caused to the world. We talk of 2050, as mentioned by Dr. Owen, the target is set to 2050, but many people still feel it's not about 2050, it's about today. Actions need to be taken. So, talking of Green Climate Fund, before I open the floor for discussion, Bhutan Trust Fund, we at Bhutan Trust Fund, through the effort of the government, we are very happy that we have been accredited to the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund. Just for some of you, especially the students, when you say accreditation, what it means basically is Bhutan Trust Fund has met all the requirements, benchmarks, to become accessible to access funds from Green Climate Fund, as represented by Dr. Owen, and we also have Adaptation Fund. So those are mainly meant for developing countries. Now Bhutan Trust Fund is a doorway to access these funds. So we at Bhutan Trust Fund, we welcome any proposals through Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund to support the environmental conservation in Bhutan. So with this, I'm sure many of you are now probably itching and getting restless to ask some questions. May I now, of course, thank our three eminent speakers for a very inspiring eye-opener to many issues on climate crisis. So with this, may I now open the floor for any questions and take advantage of our experts being here to answer your questions. Thank you. Please, it always takes somebody to break the ice. Yes, please. If you could kindly introduce yourself before you ask questions.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I am Ryota Sakamoto, a medical doctor from Kyoto University, Japan. And I have one question that I think that we almost all knows that importance of issue of climate change, and also the importance of law, and also importance of financing. But what we want to know is that what kind of law is needed to improve our or solve our issues, and what kind of process of financing is needed to solve the problem. Because that for example, I'm a medical doctor, so about the smoking, we almost all know the smoking tobacco is not good for health. But we know, but we cannot stop our behavior, change our behavior. So one of the effective law is raising the tax. So, and also if we collect the money, and it is a long process to distribute to the actual practice. So many steps there. So what kind of process of financing is needed, and what kind of actual law is needed to improve our situation? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the question is fairly clear, and I think from the panelists, probably Dr. Adil would be the best person to try to answer that. And of course, Eric and Dr. Owen also welcome to share a response. Likewise, even from the floor, if somebody has a nice way to also answer that question, you're welcome to chip in. Thank you. Dr. Adil, please.
Sure. If you want to take a few more and collect, or should I answer now?
I think taking it instantly might be better. Otherwise, we might forget what questions actually come out.
Sure.
So please go ahead. Thank you.
Can you hear me, or should I? I'll use my classroom voice. I am a teacher. And I apologize for coughing. I have a cold cough, but nothing infectious. I think that's a very good question. And partly, when I say it's a good question, it means I don't know the answer. I'm just trying to get time to think of one. But it's a good question, but it cannot be answered globally. what is a good law in one country may not be a good law in another society. So I think one of the characteristics of a good law is that it also matches the societal need. Actually, it's a very, very interesting that you've given smoking as a example. There are societies where we don't find a lot of smoking, including this one, right? But one of the biggest surprises of my life is I went to the US as a student in the 90s. And one of the biggest change I've seen in the US is on the college campus, young people nearly do not smoke. Now, when I go to Europe, which in many other areas is much more progressive, that is not the case. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, those tools are important. You can put a tax and you can use it. This also goes to GCF and other things. The instruments are important, but the instruments have to match the society. And I do not think you will have one instrument works everywhere. I can tell you what made the change in the US. There was a major congressional hearing at which the heads of the three big tobacco companies ended up in shame, very unusual for the US, bowing their head and saying, we knew this was causing death. And that image is still stuck, and you can see in US smoking data how that shift changed. Now, the interesting thing is that shift didn't change elsewhere. But smoking is a very good example because we see patterns differently in different places. So I think the research agenda is, how do I match the culture, the reality, the society, the economics of where I am doing this, right? I can give you a list of environmental policies that are extremely good in place A, and you apply them in place B, they don't work. And that doesn't mean the instrument was wrong. That means the match to society wasn't right. So I'm not trying to ward your question. What I'm saying is, if we are too technocratic about solutions, we will find those off-the-shelf solutions that don't work.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. I didn't mean to cut you. Yeah. So, thank you. So, if you understand correctly what Dr. Adil basically says, the question was, what sort of a law can we have to stop this climate crisis? Basically, you cannot have a universal law. The law has to be conducive to the area, the country, the place. So, it really depends. In Bhutan, if I speak on behalf of my country from Bhutan Trust Fund, we are very lucky. We already have laws, policies inscribed there. We have a good starting point, which other countries are trying to fight to have laws inscribed. As a first step in Bhutan, we have it already inscribed. We only bear the challenge of implementation, which is, of course, being fixed by many of the CSOs, government agencies. But what the point is, Bhutan is ahead, at least in terms of policy, regulations, laws. We have it well inscribed. Now it's just the people here who are studying law, how well you can execute it. So, yeah, sticking to the same question, if anybody else likes to share their views on it. Eric, you'd like to?
Sure. I'm going to talk, can folks in the back, okay, here's that microphone. Oh, it actually works, woohoo. I'm going to talk a little more about politics and policy than law. I hope that's okay, because that's how my brain works. The international discussion in the last few years has transitioned to the carrot and stick discussion to some extent. By that I mean, I'm going to focus more on the developed world. The U.S. Congress passed, President Biden signed recently what was inaccurate determined but it's a carrot to promote adoption of renewable energy and smart practices by business, by incentivizing it rather than penalizing it. Historically, governments dealt with these problems by regulation. Regulation brings a certain set of problems with it. I'm a fan of regulation in many contexts, if that matters. But in the developed world now, what you're seeing is The United States passed this legislation. The European Union is moving in exactly the same direction because they don't want to lose the race to renewable energy businesses that can generate enormous jobs, et cetera. And China's been at this for a long time. They now control the solar market and increasingly the wind market, but that was done through central planning, which I'm not going to address exactly. When it comes to developing countries, I think one of the more important elements that I alluded to in my speech is right intention. And Bhutan has that in spades, but the money is lacking in many cases. So, I'm vaguely hopeful that the developed world will continue to step up, or will start to step up and provide more financing. But there's also a role for the private sector and philanthropy, as we alluded to. And I think innovative private sector instruments where you can call on the goodwill of individuals in the West who want to see their investment capital used for something that matters, not just for making more money. And I think I'm hopeful as well that area will grow, because there's a lot of good intention and awareness in the world about this problem. So, thank you.
Yes, I think it's very, very important. Yeah. I think enabling environment, enabling policies, which I include both laws and regulations, is very, very important. And I agree that it depends also very much on country-by-country basis, but at the same time, it's not only the legislation, regulation. I read this paper which shows that if you also integrate policies, right? There are some estimates that integrated, for example, energy, water, urban and transport infrastructure planning, and then investing, and if you include sort of also climate consideration into it, that's of course better. But if you just integrate those policies when planning and thinking, the total infrastructure need cost can be reduced by 40%, for example. You don't do just the road, you don't do just the other sort of investment. So I think we have to look at very holistically. And although Green Climate Fund invests in adaptation mitigation projects, at the same time, we invest through capacity building, planning, adaptation planning, regulatory de-risking, etc. Unless you invest into this enabling environment, it's very difficult just to leave it to the investment, right? So it has to be taken very holistically, and for the students, I think there is a very useful database, I understand. If you look at the International Energy Agency's Policies and Measures database, it says that more than 5,500 climate policies and instruments are currently used globally. So it's probably not enough, but what I'm saying is that this climate positive investment trend has now inspired the development of a wide array of public measures. Again, it's not enough. Korea, for example, last year legislated carbon neutrality legislation. We hear about 150 countries pledging net zero, but only 14 countries, and Korea was the 14th, to enable a legislation on carbon neutrality. So there is a lot needs to be done, but again, there is a wealth of information, I think, on, with regards to the question as well. Sorry, I've been a bit longer answering.
Thank you. Hopefully that these responses probably clarified or added more doubts, I'm not sure. But as I said earlier, in Bhutan, although we are very much proactive, we have the right policies, it just reminded while Eric also spoke, I think it's also about incentivizing. If I'm honest, I think that's where in our country we may be lacking. When you want the private sector, when you talk on philanthropy, it's mainly the private sector building the bridges between the public and the government. When we try to influence people to switch to clean energy or becoming more environmentally friendly, I think we need to have regulations that incentivizes people by switching what you gain. So that's where I think sometimes the policies have to be matched with incentivizing mechanisms. So can we have more questions? Yes, Amdishan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adil, Eric, and Madam Oyun. One of the things we found, at least in climate change, is that it can't be just environment, because it's agriculture, food security, infrastructure, transport, security, migration, water. So it's no longer environment, and the most successful is when there's a Prime Minister's Council, a Presidential Council on climate change. But the other aspect that we found, and I'd really like Adil to really talk about, you know, some of these structures, what's worked, what hasn't worked. The other aspect that we found was when you start to look at the Green Climate Fund projects, they take between a year to 4 years. And it really disadvantages small countries that don't have the data, that don't have downscale data, they don't have the information, and they also are not able to de-risk the investments, they're not able to look at blended finance. So I think it'll be really good to hear from Adil what's really worked in terms of governance of climate change, especially in developing countries, and from Madam Oyun, just what kind of investments Bhutan would need if you were going to, because we at the United Nations, we do a lot of work with countries, and when we come in, we do a lot of the investments up front. The Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation being accredited means you no longer give fees to agencies. But the fact is that that investment has to be there, and so maybe, Madam Oyun, really the kind of regional institutions that Bhutan can work with. Adil, thank you.
Work in situation B, right? So what works when is the question to ask. One of the things that does seem to work across many, many different societies, and this was in Eric's example, this was in yours, this was in what was just said, is some sort of a high-level coordinating authority, right? I use the word authority and someone who has authority. Because environment and climate is such a cross-cutting issue. I remember when in my country a Ministry of Climate was being created, I kind of was not in favor of it. Because my worry was it makes it this, what we call in Pakistan, khoda line, this side thing that no one is going to take seriously. Right? Its budget is going to be small, not the most important politicians will want to be leading it. It's going to spend all of its time trying to coordinate. It's done, okay, that's a different issue. But because it is this cross-cutting thing, whether it is a Prime Minister's Council, whether it's a President's Council, whether it is His Royal Highness in this country, having that sense that not just direction, but connection has buy-in. And what that does is, I think it's not simply an institutional factor. What that does is that it conveys to society also that this is larger than one more issue. Because in some ways, and the same is true for philanthropy in some ways. In some ways, I think what we are doing here is, there are two ways to talk about it, and I'll then stop. You can talk about climate as if it is a problem to be solved. It is a problem to be solved. Or you can try to do policy and governance as if we are trying to redesign society for a better future. Right? And when you do the later, I think it works well. I'll give you one example before I shut up. I have my Nepali friends here. One of the things that fascinates me always is, for decades now, Nepal has one of the highest number of solar water heaters. Right? I think 1/3 of households in Kathmandu heat through solar water heaters. And I like this story because I'm from Pakistan, where we have much more sun. And I keep telling my Pakistani friends, if Kathmandu can do this, why can't Lahore? And so I've thought about why is that policy? And in talking to one of my friends who's here, one of the reasons is it makes economic sense. It goes back to your question, and it goes to the structure. That structures have to respond, A, to messaging at a high level, and B, to actual demand from consumers. Right? Consumers, not because someone is telling them be good to the climate, but if it saves my water bill, I'm going to do it. Right? if it saves me energy, I'm going to do it. I put up that slide with living Indus, that's something some of you know here. What we are trying, for example, in Pakistan with this living Indus is to say, let us start the climate problem not with carbon management only, but with the impacts, which in a country that's around the Indus, 85% of the economy is the Indus Basin. 91% of the population is the Indus Basin. 9 out of the 10 largest cities are within 30 kilometers of the Indus. So if we make living on the Indus livable, we solve a lot of these other problems, right? You should not be shy of starting from agriculture or shy of starting from transport to get to a climate solution, right? That to me is key.
Yeah, very brief answer to Decheng. Green Climate Fund works now with about 200 organizations, international access, and that's what Decheng was mentioning, World Bank, ADB, but also UNDP, UNEP, etc., but also direct access entities, Bhutan Trust Fund, for example, right? Although only 15% of the volume of finance is going to direct access entities because the capacity to absorb is a bit lower, but at the same time, our board told very clearly to us, in the next 4 years of the programming strategic period, please concentrate, focus more on direct access, work more with direct access, work on adaptation, work with private sector, and if need be, also please support financially capacity building, project preparation, give money to also develop project proposals, feasible project proposals as well, and please work directly with the countries rather than going through sort of big international organizations. Thank you.
Alas, thank you. I hope those responses were good, Amdishan. So could we have any more questions? Like we still have around 20 minutes. And doesn't necessarily have to be a question. Like you can share your perspective also on this session, like philanthropy and climate change. Yes, please.
Can I have the floor? Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Sonampi Wongdi, former Secretary, National Environment Commission. I'd like to thank the speakers for the excellent presentations. Since the topic is finance, I'll raise my doubts on finance, whether philanthropy or from some of the constituted bodies of the UNFCCC. My own doubt is that the needs for climate finance are huge. I mean, the climate emergency is upon us. We need to address climate change. But in terms of what is available, what is promised, there was 100 billion from 2020 onwards. Now they're working on a new quantified goal from 2024 onwards. And also there are GCF, corpus, has a corpus of, I think, less than 10 billion. Adaptation fund, less than, I think, maybe 2 billion. LDCF, same. So we can see that the sources of climate finance are very limited, although you did allude to the availability, but the way it's flowing, I mean, even the 100 billion, they say that, can you hear? They say that Oxfam, for example, OECD and Oxfam estimations are very different. Oxfam says that it's around anywhere between 18 billion to 22 billion. Let's say 18 to 22%. OECD is saying it's anywhere between 78 to 80 something percent. So there actually is not much money around. And for countries like Bhutan, what are our chances in the future as it gets more competitive? These funds also, and also Bhutan graduating, planning to graduate soon. How will it impact us? How can we, in fact, assess more wholesomely some of this? And even globally, I mean, now loss and damage, looking at establishing a facility. And the requirements for climate change, we were saying it's in trillions. 1.4 trillion was what Madam talked about. Loss and damage is anywhere between 300 to 700 billion by 2030. So the requirements are huge, and the only way, and there is money there. There is, I think, where the only way is the reform of the global financial architecture, where these have been dedicated for certain, mostly for development, and then the bureaucracies have turned into with a very narrow outlook in that area. So how could these be made available also for the greater good, for climate change? On an international level, is it time for a multilateral agreement? Is it time for, how do we, in fact, at a global level, try to resolve this? In fact, the funds you're talking about are, a lot of it is lip service, and as I mentioned, what is available is very limited. So countries like Bhutan and the rest of the vulnerable countries, how they can actually, as we move forward, get finances to address, especially adaptation and resilience building. Thank you.
Last Ashu, so the concern basically raised by former NEC secretary is that there's Bhutan, we are graduating to a middle income country. The finances are, while there's a lot of, we see 100 billion or whatever, it is still too less. And what are the chances for Bhutan to ensure that we secure that much needed money for climate action? While that will be responded by Dr. Owen, can I have the lady at the back who actually raised her hand? Please go ahead. And for the information at the back, we have Excellency Prime Minister and also Honorable Opposition sitting right in the front, so you must take a chance to share your concerns for Bhutan. This is the chance. It can be either supported by the Prime Minister and opposed by the opposition leader, or it could be collectively supported. So here's a chance, so please, in case you are...
Thank you for bringing that.
Sorry.
I'm Deepshika Sharma, working with EC Mode. I just wanted to highlight especially on Dr. Oyun's presentation on finance. So EC Mode is the accredited agency for the regional funding for adaptation fund. But we find it very challenging to actually get the proposals done. Interest from the member countries, as well as the requirements from the donor side. So I would really like to hear from Dr. Oyun about what challenges you face in GCF for regional funding. And secondly, also, since you mentioned about that we do have both leaders here. So how we'll make, basically convince the member countries on this, that tapping into regional will not diminish, their access to the national funding. I think that's most of the time is the confusion. Thank you.
Yes, very briefly. Thank you very much. I think it's a very valid question about the needs for investment in climate finance globally and the availability. So I think one has to distinguish two things, right? First, 80% of all the emissions globally are coming from only 20 countries, 20 major economies. Of course, they have to do themselves as soon as possible, as much as possible, reducing their emissions so that globally there is the reduction in emissions. For developing countries, of course, it's much more now adaptation finance, which is very, very important. And hopefully with those major economies, what Eric just mentioned about the Inflation Reduction Act, the example of, for example, Inflation Reduction Act in the US, what's called Repower Europe, I think it's another major initiative, European sort of countries also, basically, I wouldn't say directly subsidizing, but supporting or have been supporting investment in green and clean. And as we know in China, the investment that China made in renewable energy in 2021 were much more, not only investment, but the capacity, the installed capacity of renewables, I understand, was more than the whole global, all the other countries introduced in 2020. So on one side, I think it's also good news, despite all the challenges. It's a good news because it will trigger and push for a lot of competitiveness. The reason why IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and the support, even from Republicans, I think, in the US came, is not because there is a huge sort of support for the climate. It's more competing. How do we make sure that China and other countries of the world will not occupy that competitive space? So I think it's more sort of business competition. So many private sector companies around the world also saying, okay, if we don't move now, we're not becoming competitive. It used just even a few years ago, investing in green used to be anti-profit, anti-market, anti-business, but of course now everybody is seeing it as an opportunity, right? On one side, of course, it's very, very interesting and very, very enticing to see, but of course the implementation is very, very important. So hopefully this will push for those major economies to, and then not only for major, it will sort of make this shift in the trends, right? Now, for the second question, which was, right, accessing climate finance from developing countries, I think there is still a huge need also in developing countries, and we became operational, for example, only 7 years ago, right? Just before Paris Agreement and the first project was approved. We were like a startup, but already we're seeing even huge political will being built in our partner countries, which was not the case just a few years ago. Capacity, projects, a pipeline of projects. Again, I joined GCF only 4 years ago. The main problem then was, where are the projects? We have now, there was initial resource capitalization of 10 billion, and we were sitting on idle money. Projects were not coming. We were criticized. We are sitting, you're bureaucratic, and then money is not going out. But then there were not a strong pipeline. But now, even just in a few years, we see a very strong pipeline, almost $20 billion worth of project proposals, very good quality coming from developing countries. And we don't have any extra dollar to spend because, again, we've been trying very hard to also expedite and make sort of a bit more accessible. And although we've raised the next 10 billion for the programming year, and then, of course, they're paid in batches from the contributors. It's about 30 developed country contributors, right? But some developing countries also contribute as well. And then as soon as the money comes in tranches, then, of course, that's allocated through our board. So compared just even 3-4 years ago, there's a strong pipeline. At the same time, we're trying to get money out of the door as soon as possible. But as soon as possible doesn't mean that it has to go to poor quality projects. And that's why, still very, very important, to work on the, not only on enabling environment, but a good project proposal. But we will be working very closely with Bhutan. We're hoping that there will be more also projects coming as well. But I think it's not just the development finance or climate finance, it's the way every nation also works on their policies. And I also can see, even back at home in Mongolia, we can't change the country just looking at international finance flowing in, unless we change ourselves, the way we invest, regulate, and unless we, take the green investment into our hands. Of course, international climate finance will help, but we just have to change the way we, do our policies and invest, and then, improve the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, there's no doubt that finance is very important for climate action. Just sharing my own personal perspective is also equally important is actually building the right alliances. For Bhutan Trust Fund, on behalf of the government of Bhutan, we are trying to build right alliances. Sometimes for effective utilization of funds, because I think that's one area where we face the scarcity of funding is because of ineffective utilization of funds. So building the right alliances can try to curb that. So with this, could I have a last question? Because before that, after that we'll wind up. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello everybody, my name is Khaldan User and I'm a third year law student here at JSW. And my question is more or less directed to the fourth point which was presented by Professor Adil about from an international approach to a global approach regarding such issues. So basically, though it may sound quite optimistic, though it may sound quite nice when we hear that certain nations have gathered together or that they have sent delegations to discuss about such issues, it essentially boils down to the fact that we are not sending ideologies to discuss with each other, but individuals who are representing nation states with their own agendas, nation states which have their own purposes to keep in mind when it comes to such things. So even though we have got international bodies which one might say regulate such things, it essentially comes as nothing less, nothing more than an international forum for discussion of such issues regarding nations and how they can adjust with each other when it comes to such issues. So the question mainly is how can such nations with their own personal agendas, where political will mainly is the driving force representing the individual's will through their representatives, how can they come to a more singular global way of tackling such an issue instead of how we have seen as of now the international method by which we see nothing more than international forums. Basically, my question being, how can we ensure that a more global approach in the sense that how can we expect nations with individual political ideologies, political wills, agendas, and their own methods to be able to come to a singular, a unitary global way of approaching these issues, if not to tackle them completely, but essentially to be able to at least come together in a singular global way. Thank you.
So I'm sure if others have questions during lunch break, you can interact with the speakers and talk to them. So with this, while Dr. Adil tries to respond to this, I would like to give each one of you all maybe a minute to give your last words. Okay, Dr. Adil, okay, you please go ahead.
I'll again take this. I'll try to be quick. First of all, that's a brilliant question. And when someone says brilliant, that means they wish I had asked that question. So I think you're exactly right. I teach, amongst other things, international negotiation, and the way we do international negotiation on climate and environment has a fundamental problem. It's not an easy problem. Every country is supposed to go there, and your job, there may be diplomats in this room, is to do what is in the interest of your country, right? That's what a good diplomat is. There's nothing wrong with it. That's your job. And the assumption is that if each of us do what is best for my country, we will somehow miraculously come to what is good for the world. Every game theory model will tell you that that's essentially wrong, right? That model can only lead, it leads to very many good things in other negotiations, but it can only lead to the lowest common denominator, right? When we have had breakthroughs, we've usually had them because we put it on its head. And instead of saying, what can you live with, right? Which is kind of the Paris model, unfortunately. You start with, what will each of us need in order to meet this goal, right? That's a much more difficult negotiation. So I realize it's idealistic, but at some point, these shocks should remind us that we need to change that approach. There's a fundamental problem. I understand the problem, I don't have a solution. As my last point, I also wanted to thank the former secretary, because I think what you're saying is exactly right. And what EC Mode colleague said is right. Money is small. Money is not really there. There is a lot of greenwashing, I think, also happening on what is money and what is not. That's the difference between the Oxfam and other numbers, because people are being shamed. I understand all of that. It's very difficult to access. Like with any private bank, what you need to do in order to prove that you need the money is to actually prove that you don't need the money, right? Because the requirements for the projects, etc. But that's not my point. I want to surprise you with two very quick points. I think we are counting the wrong thing. We are in the international system, and I hope I do not offend anyone. We are still counting finance as if more dollars is better finance. At some point, we will start asking about impact, just like we do with poverty, right? Even if now we ask the question, so money was spent, did carbon actually reduce? Sometimes the answers won't be good, right? So at some point, we will have to change the question. At this point, it is very simple. If somehow more money is pledged, it is better than less money being pledged, whether it's ever given or not. That's why the promises are so ridiculously large, because we don't want to keep them. We are also, I think, making a mistake, not a mistake, I think we need to change in the world of adaptation. We are still counting projects by carbon. I think the honest answer is it is difficult to get money for climate impacts that are not carbon related. There's a lot of force, right? Because what the shift has happened on carbon, not on climate. But for a lot of us, the projects will be about solar water heating because of water, right? And the final point is this: I don't think there is a dearth of money. I know I will surprise people. There is no dearth of money. It's the same with philanthropy. If you look at it one way, all the philanthropy in the world cannot solve the problem. As you said, all the international money in the world can't solve the problem. The role of money in philanthropy is different. It is unlocking other money, right? The Nepal solar water heating. Please, someone calculate the cost of all the solar water heater, 1/3 of households, right? Ashray, do you know what that cost would be? No international agency would ever give Nepal that money. But once the framework is created, once an entrepreneur figures out how to put solar water heating on a rooftop in Kathmandu, what you unlock is the multiplying effect of about 800,000 households in Kathmandu. And the value of that is well above what any GCF can ever do, well above what private sector can do. So I think the shift we need is to think of this money not as dollars or even carbon, but as keys to unlock behavioral change so that people themselves, if this problem is going to solve, here is the prediction I will make. There is no way that it will be solved by official money. The only way the trillions will come, and I think they will come, is when people start seeing in their interest. And the role of philanthropy or of finance is to unlock that. The smart investing is, that's what we are trying to do with Living Indus. Can we do something that will unlock a cascading effect, not only from the private sector, but from the human being? Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. It's always interesting to have a professor in the panel. No? So, yeah, in case you'll need to, especially the law students, you should take chance of Dr. Adil being here, interact with him. Yeah, we have a last question from Lempo on the...
Thank you, Chair. Well, I should say it's such a pleasure, honor, and privilege to be here. From myself, to be here for the first time in this school and to having this wonderful opportunity to listen to, I should say, a galaxy of experts here. Let me just put very aptly here. Just coming to the issue of climate actions, what I feel is that I think there are two aspects. For Bhutan, one thing is what we can do is what Bhutan can do for itself in terms of climate action. So that's one thing. But my question here is, you are going to talk here, I think, for 3 days, and we would not be here to listen to you. And my question basically is, apart from what Bhutan can make, efforts for itself in climate change. How can Bhutan strengthen or augment its voice in the international global arena? So that's basically what I want to hear from you. So because we do so much. Of course, we should say we are so fortunate to have had the leadership in terms of environmental leadership for decades. But we are so small that what we do can be easily overrun by what other countries in the world don't do. So I want to come to a very realistic question. What can Bhutan and how can Bhutan realistically make difference to the world in terms of climate change? Thank you.
Last Limpo, thank you. I'll give it to the man here who has the money to respond to the much needed money we need. So Eric, if you could take the floor, respond to that, and also give your conclusion before we break for lunch. Please.
In answer to the honorable opposition leader, and first of all, the Karuna Foundation is actually a modestly sized foundation. So if you think I'm like running around in Bhutan tossing out gold coins everywhere I go, that's actually not how we're working.
Oh,
but, oh yeah, so shift it to somebody else if that's not what I'm doing. No, kidding. To answer the question from my perspective, what I've seen, I'm going to refer back to where we started today. We had two very compelling extended moments from two young people who are involved in this. I have a 22-year-old. He's been challenging me for some years on things. And those of us who are trying to be good parents and good citizens, we listen to our kids, right? Because they have a clarity of mind that doesn't necessarily come as you age. I'm not going to get into that, but I think many of you know what I mean. I think Bhutan needs to, on the one hand, further empower young activists and make it not just acceptable, but make it cool to get out there on the international stage and provide some resources. And honestly, you know, Karuna Foundation would love to help with this, so that young people who have the clear vision and have grown up in an age where we're not arguing about whether climate change is real, the science is clear. There's a general consensus among most people on Earth who are not living under a rock that this is a huge problem. We need to deal with it. Young people have the passion, the energy, the motivation, and the knowledge to really push this stuff forward. The reason we're seeing as much change as we're seeing now internationally, it's not necessarily because of, you know, global leaders waking up one morning and saying, oh, let's do this thing, right? It's, number one, the science is clear, and the world is telling all of us in our daily lives that this is the main problem for our species on planet Earth right now and for, you know, very long time to come. The other reason is we've had young climate leaders who are willing to speak the truth to politicians who get very squirmy and uncomfortable. I don't know if you guys have seen any of this stuff, but we have. They get very squirmy and uncomfortable with young people telling them the truth because they really can't get in their face and argue with them. They look bad, and politicians want to look good. So, empower young people, provide them the resources, provide the cultural support for young climate activists to really do their thing. And that might mean, in this case, young climate activists going to the cops and speaking truth to power, okay? That's a huge part of it. I also wanted to mention, as I close, there's a big gorilla in the room we really haven't talked about. That's income inequality. So, you know, the studies that I've seen that are out there show that uber wealthy people have enormously higher climate impacts than the average person. And there's a movement now to bring that to the forefront. Young people can play a huge role in that because, you know, these kinds of decisions made by wealthy people, they don't make them happy. They just kind of stand them out as conspicuous consumers. And I think young people need to talk about this issue more. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Now, Dr. Owen for the concluding remarks.
Yeah, very briefly, probably. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege. So, Mark Carney, who was central bank governor in the UK, said just before COP27, every financial decision has to take climate into consideration, right? Basically, we speak about systems change, but what does it mean for decision makers, for ministers, for investors, for everyone, and for students as well, right? So systems change means everything we do has to take climate or environment into consideration, and apparently, but then of course, because sometimes it's overwhelming, finding what's called leverage points, right? And system scientists apparently love this, what's called leverage points. Where are the places to intervene where small changes can bring major shifts in the system? So all of us, and including the new climate change and environment law students, we have to find what are the small, the policy changes, interventions, the right investments that can bring big shifts. And when we speak about bonds, they have to become green bonds, right? If we speak more recently, there is a lot of talk about debt restructuring. But then debt restructuring is not just maybe restructuring or forgiving debt, it's how do we make sure that with that debt restructuring, it's debt for carbon, debt restructuring for conservation. And then I think even things more recently becoming very interesting, carbon markets, right? For just preserving forests, one can probably go and ask to be paid for that. So I think a lot of interesting things in finance is happening, and I think and including Bhutan, has a lot of opportunities to look into future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can see people quite hungry, and I feel like inclined to keep you longer, especially having our Prime Minister here and opposition leader here. So now, just to, the concluding, we had this session on philanthropy and climate change. I do not want to reiterate what has happened. I'm sure you all are quite clear how philanthropy plays an important role in climate action, providing the much needed funds, just like Eric is doing a lot for Bhutan, Asia Foundation, the Green Climate Fund. So I just wanted to share my perspective that some people think that philanthropy is about money. Okay, philanthropy is involved in climate action. I don't have the money to support climate action. Why is philanthropy actually involved? It is involved because they want the right action. And to have the right action, we don't need money. Any one of us can have the right action. So philanthropy is basically about right, responsible actions. And Dr. Adil has stated the meaning of philanthropy. Compassion to humanity. We in Bhutan, we are in that society where we have plenty of it, compassion. I see no reason. I am an environment by heart, by profession, by life, whatever it is. I am so fortunate that we are in a society where compassion is the root for all good things to happen. And I would like to tell, like we have our Prime Minister, opposition leader here, senior officers, this is an indication that Bhutan is committed with right thought, right action for climate change. And with the international participants here, we would like to really reiterate Bhutan's support. This is one of the first international conferences I have attended. It's a great privilege. So please count on Bhutan. We do lack finances, yes, but I'm sure it will slowly come. We have the commitments from all three of us, three panelists here. So, and one excitement why I'm here is because of three of them. I want to try to squeeze some money into Bhutan Trust Fund for our country. So, but yes, please be inspired by Bhutan. We are committed, we are a developing country. We want to ensure that the environment goes way beyond the economic needs. We have our politicians trying our best, we have our challenges, but we can do it, and please believe in us. So with this, I would like to also thank our law school for giving me the opportunity to moderate this session, and on behalf of all our three speakers for having us all here. We look forward for these coming sessions and have a good lunch break. Thank you all very much.